A camera is a box, is a box, is a box, is a box. It might surprise you to know that the camera was invented long before photography ever existed. Cameras have been around for ages. They were called camera obscuras. Perhaps the first people to discover cameras were cavemen, and probably did so accidentally. A small hole allowing light into a cave could have projected a fuzzy upside-down image onto a wall of a cave for early man. They probably thought this was magic, or the work of gods. They may have even been afraid of it, but it wasn't magic, it was simply science. Renaissance painters would use camera obscuras to make paintings. They would make a large box with a tiny hole in it and sit inside this box and trace the scene onto canvases upside down. Inside that dark box, once those paintings were traced, the painter would take those canvases outside in the light and finish them with colored paint. When it comes to photography, it starts with... That's a different video! Cut! When it comes to photography, it starts with a conversation about silver. Silver mining began around 3000 BC in Anatolia, what is now Turkey. Early miners would notice these bright silvery rocks inside caves or mines, but notice that when they brought the silver out of the mine, it would turn black. They discovered that it was sunlight that was turning the silver black. Today, if you have silverware or other items made out of silver, they do what some people call tarnish. The silver will, when exposed to sunlight, turn dark over time. During the Industrial Age in the early 1800s, a number of scientists were experimenting with using the darkening of silver to make images. The very first scientists to work on photography were Henry Fox Talbot in England and Nicéphore Niepce in France. They kept the silver from getting exposed to light and used a liquid solution in the dark to spread the silver flecks into a type of gelatin form and painted that onto small sheets of glass. Those glass sheets, called plates, which were coated in silver, were then put inside a camera obscura and allowed to be exposed to light. The light areas of the scene would shine through the lens and be focused on the silver plate. They would turn the silver dark. The areas of the scene that were dark would not shine light through the lens and onto the plate, and thus those areas would turn dark. Those scientists then used another chemical to wash away the areas of that silver plate that weren't exposed. That was all done in the dark. When it was over, they had what was called a negative. That chemical process was the basis for photography. The negative was used in exactly the same way, opposite. Light was shown through the negative. Instead of coating a piece of glass with the silver gelatin, that silver gelatin was painted onto paper. What was dark became light, and what was light became dark. And exactly the opposite way. A negative of a negative is a positive. This became the very first black and white photograph. The first successful black and white photograph was taken by Niepce on his balcony in France, as you see here. This picture is what you see here is the world's first photograph. All photography, including motion picture photography, digital photography, video photography, and even photography taken with your iPhone, all has its roots in this process. Technology developed over time where that silver gelatin process was improved upon and even further. If you remember what we discussed last week about color, that process of making black and white photography led to color photography. Layers of silver gelatin, instead of on a piece of glass, were coated onto a thin strip of plastic, what we now know of as film. Each one of those layers were sensitive to different colors of light. There was a red layer, a green layer, and a blue layer. Each of these layers of silver gelatin, exposed to various colors of light, produced black and white layers of silver gelatin. To end at that process would have only produced a multi-layer black and white photograph. Not much use. However, scientists later figured a way to have each of those color-blind layers that only saw their own colors, converted that silver halide to color dye to make the opposite color of that layer. Those three layers of colors, red, green, and blue, created a color image in reverse. If you remember the color wheel from last week, there are three colors, red, green, and blue. Their complementary colors are yellow, cyan, and magenta. The opposite of red is cyan, the opposite of green is magenta, and the opposite of blue is yellow. Color photography adds or subtracts one of these colors to complete the color process. In a color negative, a green tree is red, a blue sky is yellow, but when you do a negative of a negative, like we talked about earlier, black and white photography, you get the opposite of those colors. So a green tree that you photographed shows up as red in the negative, and when you print the photograph onto paper, that opposite of a red tree on the negative turns back into the green tree on the print. If it's an opposite of an opposite, or a negative of a negative, making the positive, or thus the real scene again. Photography worked like this for more than 150 years. Thin strips of negatives called film were loaded into cameras and used to make pictures. When astronauts went to the moon, a new kind of photography was needed. Scientists with NASA were some of the first people to work with what we know now as digital photography. Photographs were needed to be electronically transmitted from spacecraft back to the Earth. They devised a way to replace the film inside a camera with an electronic sensor that was sensitive to light. Instead of silver gelatin layer being sensitive to light, very tiny pixels, each sensitive to an intensity and color of light, recorded that information mathematically and saved it to memory. That data was then transmitted back to Earth digitally, only to be reproduced later. This was the beginning of digital photography. Those original digital cameras were very expensive, but the technology later, almost 30 years later, became affordable and inexpensive enough so that regular people could use them. My very first digital camera cost my newspaper around $50,000 in 1996. We only had one of those cameras, and we used it for major events where we didn't have time to drive the film back to the newspaper. 4 years later, that technology was improved and the pictures were markedly better, and the cost of a better camera in 2000 was around $5,000. I was given two of those $5,000 cameras, and for the most part, never made photos the old-fashioned way again. Digital photography has improved and improved and improved and improved again. I used that $5,000 camera to make pictures during 9/11. Those images were 2.5 megapixels. Only 7 years later, in 2007, Apple would create the very first iPhone, and for roughly only $500, the iPhone could take photographs with higher resolution than my $5,000 camera ever could. In the late 1990s, using modems and telephone lines, it could take up to 20 minutes to send or transmit a photo back to my newspaper. By 2000, this would take only 2 minutes. Shortly thereafter, we could use cellular phone technology to send pictures back almost instantaneously. But really, all of these cameras are the same, even the camera obscurers used by Renaissance painters. A camera is a box, is a box, is a box. Even your iPhone camera seen in this photo is a box, albeit a tiny one. It still uses the same principle of light shining through and focusing onto a sensitive plane inside a box. I got my start in photography in the Navy. After graduating from basic photography school in the Navy, I worked at a small base newspaper. My work was recognized, and I was sent to Syracuse University to be a Navy photojournalist. At that time, there were only 8 Navy photojournalists. We were tasked with documenting the most important events in the U.S. Navy history. This is some of the work I did while being in the Navy. When I got out of the Navy, I came to Westchester and worked for what you now know as the Journal News. I photographed all kinds of assignments for the Journal News. My work on 9/11 was recognized, and shortly thereafter I went to work for the New York Daily News. I now work for the New York Post. Throughout my time as a photographer, I photographed more than 20 World Series, 4 Super Bowls, 5 presidents, and even 4 wars. On occasion, I've been shot at, beaten up, spent nights in the hospital, and even was arrested, all for making pictures. However, I've enjoyed every minute of my time being a photographer. I consider it a gift that I was able to get to do what I wanted to do. I don't really consider it a job because it's something I truly enjoy.